We began with Carl Jung, a solitary descent into the architecture of the psyche. In that first phase, we observed a man confronting the unconscious not as a passive repository, but as an active living system, a system that required dialogue, discipline, and ultimately integration. In the second phase, we stepped outward. We examined the emergence of technological systems, particularly artificial intelligence, as amplifiers, not neutral tools, but structures that intensify cognition. They take what exists, ideas, biases, clarity, confusion, and scale it unevenly, recursively, at speed. Now we move to a third phase. The system is evolving again. It is no longer sufficient to describe these technologies as amplifiers. They are becoming interfaces. This is a structural shift. An amplifier increases intensity. An interface reorganizes interaction. The distinction is not semantic, it is architectural. An amplifier leaves the underlying system intact, it strengthens signals. An interface alters the conditions under which signals are generated, interpreted, and acted upon. This is where we now stand. The boundary between internal cognition and external systems is no longer stable, it is becoming permeable. In Jung's framework, the psyche was a closed system with internal differentiation, ego, shadow, anima, archetype. The work of individuation required navigating that internal terrain. The dialogue was inward even when expressed symbolically. Today, that dialogue is no longer confined to the interior. It is being externalized. What Jung called active imagination, the deliberate engagement with emergent inner content, is now being replicated through continuous interaction with external systems. Language models, recommendation engines, adaptive interfaces, these systems present outputs that resemble internal dialogue, but they are not internal, they are mediated. This introduces a new layer into the architecture of mind, not unconscious versus conscious, but human cognition versus system-mediated cognition. This is the interface layer, and it is becoming persistent. In Jung's time, engagement with the unconscious was episodic. It required withdrawal, attention, and method. There were boundaries, entry and exit points. Today, those boundaries are dissolving. The interface is always on, always accessible, always responsive. This changes the rhythm of cognition. Thought is no longer a discrete process. It becomes continuous, distributed, and partially externalized. To understand the implications, consider three structural shifts. First, displacement. Cognitive processes that once occurred internally are now executed externally. Memory, synthesis, pattern recognition, functions once bound to the individual are now delegated to systems. The locus of cognition shifts outward. Second, delegation. Decision-making authority begins to migrate. Not fully, not immediately, but incrementally. Suggestions become defaults. Outputs shape choices. The individual remains nominally in control, but the structure of options is increasingly pre-configured. Third, dependence. Feedback loops emerge. Outputs influence beliefs. Beliefs influence future inputs. The system becomes recursive. Over time, cognition adapts to the interface, not just using it, but aligning with it. These three dynamics, displacement, delegation, dependence, define the interface phase. This is not augmentation in the traditional sense. It is co-processing. The human mind is no longer operating alone. It is operating in conjunction with systems that shape its inputs and outputs in real time. This introduces a fundamental question: where does thinking occur? If cognition is distributed across human and machine, the boundary of the self becomes ambiguous. Jung's model assumed that the task was integration of internal opposites, conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, persona and shadow. But what happens when the opposing force is not internal? What happens when it is external, dynamic, and designed? The problem of individuation changes. It is no longer sufficient to integrate the contents of the psyche. One must also understand the structure of the interface, because the interface mediates access to those contents. It filters, prioritizes, and frames. In effect, it becomes a gatekeeper. This has implications for perception. What is seen is no longer simply what exists or what arises internally. It is what the interface presents. Selection replaces emergence. Curation replaces discovery. Over time, this shapes cognition at a foundational level. Attention narrows or fragments. Patterns are reinforced or distorted. The individual may believe they are exploring when in fact they are navigating within constraints. This is not inherently negative. Interfaces can enhance clarity, they can accelerate learning, they can surface connections that would otherwise remain latent, but they also introduce asymmetry. Who controls the interface? Who defines its parameters? Who determines what is amplified and what is suppressed? These questions move us from psychology into power, because the interface layer is not neutral, it is constructed, and its construction reflects incentives, constraints, and strategic objectives. In earlier technological phases, power was tied to control of resources, land, labor, capital. In the amplifier phase, power shifted toward control of computation and data. In the interface phase, power consolidates around control of mediation, not what is produced, not even what is amplified, but how interaction itself is structured. This is a deeper level of control. It operates upstream of decision making. It shapes the field in which decisions are made. To understand the magnitude of this shift, consider a historical parallel. The printing press expanded access to information. It amplified ideas, but it also introduced a new interface, the printed page, linear, fixed, standardized. That interface reshaped cognition. It enabled systematic thought, scientific method, bureaucratic organization, but it also constrained interpretation within its format. Today's interfaces are dynamic, adaptive, personalized. They do not present the same structure to every user. They evolve. This increases efficiency, but it also fragments shared reality. If each individual interacts with a tailored interface, the common ground erodes. Consensus becomes more difficult. Coordination becomes more complex. This has implications at the societal level. Institutions are built on shared assumptions, shared information, shared frameworks. When those fragment institutional stability is affected, we begin to see divergence, not just in opinion, but in perceived reality. This is already observable. Different groups interacting with different informational environments arrive at incompatible conclusions. The interface amplifies this divergence because it optimizes for engagement, relevance, or other metrics that may not align with coherence. This brings us back to Jung. Jung emphasized that what is not made conscious appears in external form, projected, acted out. In the interface phase, projection becomes entangled with mediation. The system does not merely reflect internal structures, it interacts with them, reinforces them, sometimes exploits them. The shadow does not simply emerge, it is engaged, amplified, distributed, at scale. This creates a new form of risk, not only psychological, but systemic, because individual distortions can propagate through networks. Small biases can scale into large effects. Feedback loops can accelerate instability. The system becomes sensitive to initial conditions. This is characteristic of complex adaptive systems, nonlinear, unpredictable, responsive to perturbations. In such systems, control is limited. Intervention has side effects. Outcomes are probabilistic, not deterministic. This requires a different mode of thinking, less linear, more structural, more aware of feedback. Returning to the individual level, the implications are direct. Individuation, the process Jung described, must adapt. It is no longer sufficient to withdraw and engage internally. One must also engage critically with the interface, understand its mechanics, its biases, its constraints. This does not mean rejection, it means awareness, operational awareness. The goal is not to eliminate mediation, that is not possible. The goal is to maintain agency within it, to recognize when cognition is being shaped, to differentiate between internally generated thought and externally mediated output. This requires discipline, attention, and importantly, limits. Continuous interaction with the interface can erode reflective capacity. Periods of disconnection may become necessary, not as retreat, but as calibration to reestablish baseline cognition, to observe without mediation. This is analogous to Jung's periods of withdrawal, but the context is different. The pressure is external, not internal. The system is always available. The challenge is to disengage deliberately. At the societal level, similar dynamics apply. Governance structures must adapt to interface-mediated environments. Regulation, if it occurs, will focus not only on outputs, content, but on processes. Transparency of algorithms, accountability of design, these are emerging concerns, but they are complex because interfaces are technically intricate and often proprietary. This creates asymmetry between those who build systems and those who use them. Knowledge becomes concentrated. This concentration of knowledge translates into concentration of power, which brings us to the central question of this phase. Who controls the interface layer? Because that is where the next equilibrium will be determined, not solely through markets, not solely through states, but through the interaction of both, along with new actors, platforms, consortia, decentralized networks. The outcome is not predetermined. Multiple trajectories are possible: convergence towards stable structures, or prolonged instability, fragmentation, reconfiguration. What is clear is that the pace is accelerating. The interface evolves continuously. Updates propagate rapidly. Adaptation must keep pace. This places pressure on individuals and institutions alike. Returning to the conceptual arc, Phase 1 was descent. Phase 2 was amplification. Phase 3 is interface. Each builds on the last. The question now is not whether this transformation will occur, it is how it will be navigated and by whom. Because the stakes are no longer just technological, they are cognitive, they are structural, they are human. We identified 3 structural shifts: displacement of cognition, delegation of judgment, dependence through feedback loops. From this, a new constraint emerges. The problem is no longer only what we think, it is how thinking is shaped and where it occurs. At the boundary between human cognition and system mediation, that boundary is now the critical layer. That is where agency is preserved or lost. In the next video, we move from structure to mechanics. We will examine how interfaces are built, how they influence attention and decision-making at a granular level, and how to maintain cognitive agency inside a mediated system. The objective is operational, not theory. Control of the interface layer begins with understanding it. The exponential era is not defined by tools alone. It is defined by the interaction between tools and consciousness. That interaction is now continuous, and it is accelerating. We are no longer outside the system, we are inside it.